I never expected my Uncle David to stand up at our family reunion and announce to everyone that I was a disappointment who would never amount to anything, but I certainly didn't expect his boss to walk through those doors 5 minutes later and call me by a title that would silence the entire room forever. Sometimes the most devastating moments become the foundation for the most powerful revelations. And what happened that summer afternoon changed not just how my family saw me, but how I finally learned to see myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to the Martinez Family Reunion arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in July, the kind of day when the air conditioning struggled against the Texas heat and everything felt heavy with unspoken tension. I found it wedged between a stack of corporate reports and my morning coffee, the cheerful pastel envelope seeming almost mocking against the serious documents that typically filled my workspace. Martinez Family Reunion 2024 was written in my cousin Sofia's distinctive handwriting, complete with little doodles of barbecue grills and party hats. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of forced cheerfulness, promising 3 days of family bonding at Uncle David's sprawling ranch house outside San Antonio. Pool parties, horseback riding, and of course, the traditional Saturday night dinner, where everyone would gather to catch up on each other's lives. I set the invitation aside and returned to the quarterly financial projections spread across my desk. Numbers had always made sense to me in a way that family dynamics never had. Clean columns of data that told clear stories without the messy complications of hurt feelings and unspoken resentments. The Martinez family gatherings had become increasingly difficult territory to navigate over the past 5 years, ever since I'd made the decision that had essentially exiled me from their understanding of success. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Did you get Sofia's invitation? Your uncle is so excited to see everyone. It's been too long since we've all been together." The guilt in her message was subtle, but unmistakable. My mother, Carmen Martinez, had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to bridge the growing gap between me and the rest of the family. She understood, better than most, why I'd chosen the path I had, but she also felt the weight of family expectations and the particular strain of having a daughter who didn't quite fit the mold that the Martinez women were supposed to occupy. I typed back a non-committal response about checking my schedule, though we both knew I would ultimately attend. Missing a Martinez family reunion wasn't really an option, not if I wanted to maintain any semblance of relationship with my extended family. The cost of absence would be months of passive-aggressive comments and concerned phone calls about why I was pulling away from the people who loved me. The truth was more complicated than simple avoidance. The Martinez family had very specific ideas about success, about the proper trajectory for a young woman's life, and about what constituted meaningful achievement. These ideas had been shaped by generations of struggle and hard-won prosperity, by immigrant grandparents who had built something substantial from nothing, and by the fierce pride that came from overcoming obstacles through traditional paths of advancement. My grandfather, Roberto Martinez, had arrived from Mexico with nothing but determination and an 8th-grade education. Through decades of back-breaking work and construction, he had built a small empire of successful businesses that now employed half the extended family. His sons had followed suit, each carving out their own piece of the Martinez legacy through real estate, restaurant ownership, and various other ventures that kept the family name prominent in San Antonio's business community. Uncle David, the oldest of my grandfather's sons, had taken over the construction business and expanded it into one of the largest commercial development firms in South Texas. His success was measured in concrete terms, literally and figuratively. Shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments across 3 counties bore the Martinez construction logo. He employed over 200 people, coached Little League baseball, and served on the Chamber of Commerce. By any traditional measure, Uncle David embodied everything a Martinez man should be. The women in our family had their own version of expected success. marriage to good men, children raised with strong values, and careers that complemented rather than competed with family life. My cousins had largely followed this template, becoming teachers, nurses, small business owners, and devoted mothers. They gathered for baby showers and birthday parties, shared recipes and parenting advice, and created the kind of tight-knit feminine support network that had sustained the Martinez women for generations. And then there was me, Elena Maria Martinez, the outlier who had somehow lost her way despite every advantage the family had provided. At 28, I was unmarried, childless, and employed in a field that no one in my family quite understood or approved of. While my cousins were posting pictures of their children's soccer games and family vacations, I was traveling to corporate boardrooms and investment meetings in cities that felt as foreign to my family as another planet. The decision to pursue a career in private equity had been pragmatic rather than rebellious. I had graduated from UT Austin with degrees in finance and economics, planning initially to join one of the family businesses in some capacity. But a summer internship at a Dallas investment firm had opened my eyes to a different kind of business, one that dealt with the architecture of commerce rather than its day-to-day operations. I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of market dynamics, an ability to see patterns in financial data that others missed, and most importantly, a talent for identifying undervalued companies that could be transformed through strategic intervention. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that energized me, and the financial rewards were substantial enough to provide the kind of security my immigrant grandfather would have appreciated, even if he couldn't understand the mechanism by which it was achieved. But explaining private equity to a family of builders and business owners was like describing abstract art to people who valued concrete functionality. When Uncle David asked what I did for a living, I would fumble through explanations about buying and restructuring companies, about leveraged buyouts and capital optimization. His eyes would glaze over with the kind of polite incomprehension reserved for subjects that seemed both unnecessarily complicated and vaguely suspect. "So you make money from other people's businesses without actually building anything yourself?" he had asked during our last family gathering, his tone carrying the particular blend of confusion and disapproval that I had come to expect from these conversations. The question stung because it contained just enough truth to be painful while missing the essential point entirely. Yes, I made money from other people's businesses, but I also helped save companies from bankruptcy, streamlined operations that created rather than eliminated jobs, and provided capital that allowed growth that might never have been possible otherwise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The work required the same entrepreneurial instincts that had driven my grandfather's success, just applied in a different context. But context mattered less than perception in family dynamics, and the perception was that Elena had chosen a path that prioritized personal financial gain over the kinds of tangible, community-building contributions that the Martinez family valued. I wasn't creating jobs for local workers, wasn't building structures that would stand for generations, wasn't raising the next generation of Martinez children to carry on the family traditions. Instead, I lived alone in a downtown Dallas high-rise, drove a car that cost more than some of my cousins' annual salaries, and spent my weekends reviewing acquisition targets rather than attending family barbecues. From the outside, my life probably looked successful by conventional measures, but it didn't look like Martinez's success, and that distinction had become increasingly problematic as the years passed. The most painful part wasn't the lack of understanding. It was the growing sense that my family had given up on me entirely. The questions about when I might settle down and start a family had gradually given way to resigned acceptance that Elena was destined to be the spinster career woman, the cautionary tale about what happened when young women lost sight of what really mattered in life. My mother tried to bridge these gaps with determined optimism, highlighting my achievements in terms the family could appreciate. "Elena just closed a deal worth $50 million, she would announce at family dinners, her pride evident. even as she watched the information bounce off her audience like raindrops on concrete. $50 million was an impressive number, but it was abstract in a way that Uncle David's latest shopping center development was not. You could drive by his projects and point them out to your children. You couldn't point to a leveraged buyout. As I sat at my desk that Tuesday morning, the reunion invitation seeming to mock me with its cheerful insistence on family togetherness, I found myself weighing the familiar calculation of attendance versus avoidance. The rational part of my mind argued for a polite excuse, a scheduling conflict that would spare everyone the awkwardness of pretending my choices made sense within the Martinez worldview. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being 7 years old and helping my grandfather mix concrete in his backyard, insisted that family connections were worth preserving even when they were complicated. Roberto Martinez had died 3 years ago, and his absence had left a void in the family's center of gravity that no one had quite figured how to fill. Uncle David had assumed the role of family patriarch, but his leadership style was more authoritarian than my grandfather's gentle guidance had been. I picked up my phone and called my mother, knowing that her voice would help clarify the decision I was already making despite my reservations. "Mija," she answered after the first ring, her tone carrying the warmth that had sustained me through countless childhood disappointments and adult frustrations. "I was just thinking about you." "I got Sofia's invitation," I said, settling back in my desk chair and letting the familiar comfort of her voice wash over me. "Tell me honestly, do you think I should go?" There was a pause, and I could picture her in her kitchen, probably preparing lunch for my father while mentally calculating the various family dynamics at play in my question. Carmen Martinez had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found ways to maintain connections even when personalities clashed. "Your family misses you," she said finally. "And you miss them, even when you pretend you don't. Uncle David asks about you every time we talk." "Uncle David asks about me so he can shake his head sadly about my life choices," I corrected, though without real bitterness. I had long since accepted that my uncle's disapproval came from a place of concern rather than malice. "He worries about you," my mother admitted. "They all do. You're successful, Elena, but success without family feels incomplete to people like your uncle. He doesn't understand why you've chosen to be alone when you could have both career and family." The assumption that I had chosen to be alone, rather than simply not yet found the right person to build a life with, was typical of how my family interpreted my circumstances. In their worldview, marriage and children were default settings that required deliberate avoidance rather than natural outcomes that might or might not occur, depending on countless variables beyond individual control. "Maybe it would be good for everyone to see how well you're doing," my mother continued. "Sometimes understanding comes through exposure rather than explanation." Her optimism was touching, even if I didn't entirely share it. The gap between my life and my family's expectations had grown wider over the years, not narrower, and I had learned to manage their disappointment rather than hope for their approval. But the idea of 3 days at Uncle David's ranch, swimming in the pool where I had learned to dive as a child and eating my aunt's legendary barbacoa, held an appeal that had nothing to do with validation and everything to do with belonging to something larger than my individual achievements. "I'll go," I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. "But I'm driving myself, and I'm staying in town rather than at the ranch. I need the option of retreat if things get too complicated." "Fair enough," my mother agreed, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Elena, whatever happens, remember that being different doesn't mean being wrong. Your grandfather understood that, even if he never said it out loud." After we hung up, I looked again at the reunion invitation, now seeing it not as a challenge to my life choices, but as an opportunity to reconnect with the parts of my heritage that had nothing to do with career paths or life timelines. The Martinez family might not understand my professional success, but they had given me the foundation of resilience and ambition that had made that success possible. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the reunion with the same methodical attention I brought to business deals. I arranged for a suite at a boutique hotel in downtown San Antonio, close enough to be convenient, but far enough to maintain some psychological distance. I selected clothes that would signal respect for family occasions without apologizing for my prosperity. Most importantly, I prepared myself mentally for the inevitable conversations about my single status, my career choices, and my apparent inability to prioritize the things that mattered most to the Martinez family. The drive from Dallas to San Antonio took me through landscape that had shaped my childhood understanding of possibility. Rolling hills covered with scrub oak and cactus gave way to the sprawling suburbs that housed the American dream my grandparents had pursued with such determination. As I pulled into Uncle David's circular driveway on Friday afternoon, I felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that had characterized every family gathering of my adult life. The ranch house sprawled across several acres of carefully maintained property, its adobe walls and red tile roof reflecting the Spanish colonial architecture that Uncle David had favored in both his personal and professional projects. The circular driveway was already crowded with the pickup trucks, SUVs, and family sedans that belonged to my various aunts, uncles, and cousins. Through the large windows, I could see the movement of people setting up tables and arranging food, the familiar choreography of Martinez family hospitality. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering the emotional energy required for the performance of family connection. My black BMW looked dramatically out of place among the practical vehicles that surrounded it, a visual reminder of the gulf between my lifestyle and my family's more grounded choices. But I was here, and that had to count for something. As I approached the front door, it swung open to reveal my cousin Sofia, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at my arrival. Sofia had always been the family connector, the one who remembered birthdays and organized gatherings and somehow managed to maintain close relationships with relatives whose only common ground was their shared DNA. "Elena, I was starting to worry you weren't going to make it," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and barbecue smoke. "Everyone's here, and Tia Rosa has been asking about you all afternoon." I followed Sofia into the familiar chaos of a Martinez family gathering, feeling myself slip into the patterns of interaction that had been established over decades of shared celebrations. Aunts and uncles greeted me with the warm but slightly careful affection reserved for family members who had become somewhat foreign. Cousins updated me on children and jobs and local gossip, and gradually I began to remember why these connections mattered despite their complications. Uncle David appeared as I was accepting a plate of my aunt's famous tamales, his presence commanding attention even in the crowded living room. At 55, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built something substantial and knew his place in the world. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, but I noticed the way his eyes assessed me with the same calculating attention he probably brought to construction projects. "Elena, good to see you," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him the unofficial head of the family since my grandfather's death. "You look well. Business must be treating you right." The comment was neutral enough on the surface, but I heard the subtext that had characterized our interactions for years. Business was treating me right in financial terms, but the question of whether I was treating life right remained unresolved in his mind. Uncle David measured success by different metrics than profit margins and investment returns, and by his standards, I was still very much a work in progress. "Things are going well," I replied, accepting the familiar dance of careful conversation. "How's the construction business? Mom mentioned you're working on a new project near the medical center." His face brightened as he launched into a description of the mixed-use development that would bring retail shops, office space, and residential units to a previously underutilized area. I listened with genuine interest, recognizing the passion that drove his work even as I noted the implicit contrast between his tangible contributions to the community and my more abstract professional activities. The evening proceeded with the comfortable rhythms of family gathering. We ate too much food prepared by aunts who had been perfecting their recipes for decades, caught up on family news and neighborhood gossip, and gradually settled into the kind of relaxed conversation that made the effort of maintaining these connections feel worthwhile. But I was aware, throughout the evening, of the careful way certain topics were avoided, of the subtle editing that occurred whenever conversation touched on my life in Dallas or my work in private equity. It wasn't malicious, but it was noticeable. This collective decision to skirt around the aspects of my existence that didn't translate easily into their frame of reference. As the night wound down and relatives began to disperse to their various accommodations, Uncle David approached me. Again, this time with a more serious expression that suggested the kind of family conversation I had been hoping to avoid. "Elena, walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the back patio where we could speak privately. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something." I followed him outside, noting the way the pool lights reflected off the water and remembering summer evenings from my childhood when the biggest concern was whether I would be allowed to stay up late enough to see the fireflies. Uncle David settled into one of the heavy wooden chairs that surrounded the outdoor dining table, his posture suggesting this would be more than casual conversation. "I've been thinking about the family business," he began, his tone carrying the weight of decisions that affected multiple generations. "About succession planning and bringing the next generation into leadership positions. You have skills that could be valuable to Martinez Construction, Elena. Financial expertise that we don't have in-house." The offer shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Uncle David had never before suggested that my professional abilities might have practical application within the family enterprise. I felt a flutter of possibility, quickly tempered by uncertainty about his motivations and expectations. "What kind of role are you thinking about?" I asked carefully, aware that this conversation would likely determine the tenor of our relationship for years to come. "Chief Financial Officer initially," he said, leaning forward with the kind of intensity he brought to negotiations, "with the possibility of broader operational responsibility as you learned the business. We're at a point where professional management could take us to the next level, and having family in key positions would ensure continuity of values and vision." The proposal was generous by any measure, and I could hear the genuine desire for family connection underlying the business logic. Uncle David was offering me a path back into the Martinez fold, a way to apply my skills in service of the family legacy while rebuilding the personal relationships that had been strained by my choices. But I also heard the assumptions embedded in his offer. The implicit suggestion that my current career was somehow less meaningful than work that directly served family interests. The role he was proposing would be significant and challenging, but it would also require abandoning the professional identity I had spent years building in favor of becoming a supporting player in Uncle David's vision of Martinez Construction's future. "That's a generous offer," I said, buying time to process the implications. "I'm honored that you would consider me for such an important position." "Think about it over the weekend," he said, standing and placing a hand on my shoulder, with paternal affection. "I know change is difficult, but sometimes we have to choose between personal ambition and family responsibility. Your grandfather understood that balance, and I think you do too." As I drove back to my hotel that night, Uncle David's words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable resonance. The choice he had presented wasn't really between different career paths. It was between different definitions of success, different ways of understanding my obligations to the people who had shaped my life and values. The next morning brought the second day of the reunion, focused on outdoor activities and casual socializing. I arrived at the ranch to find my cousins organizing horseback riding expeditions and pool volleyball tournaments, the kind of activities that had made childhood family gatherings magical and now felt slightly forced in their deliberate fun. I spent the morning catching up with relatives I rarely saw outside these formal occasions, learning about new babies and job changes and the countless small developments that constitute family life. The conversations were pleasant, but carefully bounded, avoiding the topics that might reveal too much about the gulf between our life choices and priorities. By afternoon, I had settled into a comfortable rhythm of family socializing, feeling more relaxed than I had expected about navigating these complicated relationships. The anxiety I had carried into the weekend was beginning to fade, replaced by genuine appreciation for the connections that persisted despite philosophical differences about success and responsibility. It was then that Uncle David decided to make his announcement. We had gathered for the traditional Saturday afternoon barbecue, with the entire extended family arranged around the pool area in various configurations of lawn chairs and picnic tables. The scene was quintessentially Martinez. 3 generations of family members sharing food and stories while children splashed in the pool, and adults discussed everything from local politics to football prospects for the coming season. Uncle David called for attention with the natural authority that had made him the family's unofficial spokesman for important occasions. He stood near the head of the largest picnic table, his presence commanding immediate silence from the 40-plus family, members who had gathered for the reunion. "I want to take a moment to talk about family," he began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for speeches at wedding receptions and graduation parties, about what it means to be a Martinez and about the responsibilities that come with carrying our name. I felt a flutter of unease as his gaze swept across the assembled family, lingering for a moment on me before moving on to encompass the entire group. This had the feeling of a prepared speech rather than spontaneous remarks, and I had learned to be wary of Uncle David's prepared speeches. Our father, Roberto Martinez, came to this country with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else, he continued, hitting familiar themes that had shaped family mythology for decades. He built something substantial through discipline, sacrifice, and most importantly, through understanding that individual success means nothing if it doesn't serve the larger purpose of family and community. Heads nodded around the gathering, as family members recognized the familiar narrative of immigrant achievement and generational responsibility. This was the story that had shaped our understanding of success, the framework that had guided important decisions for decades. "I see some of his grandchildren here today who have honored that legacy," Uncle David continued, his tone taking on a more pointed quality. "Sofia, who teaches our children and serves her community every day. Miguel, who has expanded our family business and created jobs for local workers. Rosa, who is raising the next generation of Martinez children with our values and traditions." Each mention brought smiles and murmurs of approval from the assembled family. Sofia blushed with pleasure at the recognition. Miguel nodded acknowledgement of his contributions to Martinez construction, and Rosa waved from her position near the kiddie pool where she was supervising her 3 young daughters. "But I also see family members who have lost their way," Uncle David said, his voice gaining steel as he moved toward his main point. "Who have chosen personal ambition over family responsibility, who have forgotten that success without family is meaningless." The change in tone was unmistakable, and I felt every eye in the gathering turn toward me with the kind of collective attention that made my skin crawl. This was no longer a general speech about family values. This had become a specific indictment of my life choices, delivered with the authority of the family patriarch in front of every relative who mattered. "Elena," Uncle David said, looking directly at me with disappointment written clearly across his face. "You're 28 years old, making more money than you know what to do with. But what do you have to show for it? No husband, no children, no real connection to the community that raised you? You've become so focused on accumulating wealth that you've forgotten what wealth is supposed to serve." The silence that followed his words was deafening. I could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes watching my reaction, waiting to see how I would respond to this public challenge to my entire adult life. My cousins looked uncomfortable, my aunts and uncles uncertain, and my mother's face reflected the kind of pain that comes from watching your child be hurt by people you love. Success without family is just sophisticated selfishness, Uncle, David continued, warming to his theme. And frankly, Elena, that's what your life looks like from here. A cautionary tale about what happens when we forget our obligations to the people who made our success possible. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what felt like a final judgment on my character and choices. Your grandfather would be ashamed of what you've become. A failure at the things that actually matter, no matter how much money you make and whatever it is you do up in Dallas. The word failure hung in the air like a physical presence, reverberating through the suddenly silent gathering with devastating finality. I felt something crack inside me, not from anger, but from the accumulation of years of subtle disapproval crystallizing into this moment of absolute rejection. I had prepared myself for awkward conversations about my single status, for gentle pressure about career choices, for the familiar weight of not quite measuring up to Martinez family expectations. But I had not prepared myself for this level of public humiliation, for being labeled a failure in front of every person whose opinion had shaped my understanding of success and worth. The worst part wasn't the cruelty of Uncle David's words, it was the way they resonated with my own deepest fears about the choices I had made. Was I really just a cautionary tale about misplaced priorities? Had I traded meaningful connection for financial success in ways that would leave me ultimately empty despite my professional achievements? I stood up slowly, aware that every movement was being watched and interpreted by family members who had never seen this kind of open conflict at a Martinez gathering. My legs felt unsteady, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't afford to display in this public forum. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. "I need some air." As I walked toward the house, I heard the uncomfortable murmur of voices beginning to process what had just occurred, some defending Uncle David's right to speak hard truths, others questioning whether public humiliation was ever appropriate within family contexts. But I didn't turn around to gauge the full reaction. I couldn't afford to see the sympathy or agreement or judgment in their faces. I found myself in Uncle David's study, a room I had always found comforting during childhood visits, but which now felt like a monument to the kind of success I would apparently never achieve in my family's eyes. The walls were covered with photographs documenting 4 decades of Martinez construction projects, community involvement, and family celebrations. Evidence of a life lived according to principles that everyone could understand and respect. I sank into the leather chair behind his desk, finally allowing myself to feel the full impact of what had just occurred. The man who had served as a father figure during important parts of my childhood had just declared me a failure in front of every person whose opinion mattered to me. Not quietly, not privately, but as a public statement about the Martinez family's values and my deviation from them. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "I'm coming inside." Before I could respond, she appeared in the doorway, her face reflecting the complicated emotions of a woman caught between her daughter and her family. Carmen Martinez had spent years trying to bridge these gaps, and now she was witnessing the complete breakdown of her diplomatic efforts. "I'm sorry," she said simply, settling into the chair across from the desk. That was cruel and unnecessary, regardless of David's intentions. Was he wrong, though? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Am I really just a cautionary tale about misplaced priorities? My mother was quiet for a long moment, considering her response with the care of someone who understood that wrong words could deepen wounds that might never fully heal. "You're different," she said finally. "That doesn't make you wrong, and it certainly doesn't make you a failure. Your uncle sees the world in very specific terms, Elena. For him, success has one definition, family has one structure, and purpose has one direction. He can't imagine that there might be other ways to build a meaningful life." "But what if he's right?" I pressed. What if all my professional success is meaningless because I haven't prioritized the things that actually matter? Before my mother could respond, we heard the sound of cars pulling into the driveway, followed by voices and footsteps that suggested new arrivals at the reunion. Through the study window, I could see Uncle David walking toward the front entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated something important was happening. "Sounds like more family arriving," my mother observed, standing to look out the window. "Maybe this is a good time for you to rejoin the gathering. Let people see that you're not broken by David's words." I wasn't sure I was ready to face the group again, but I also knew that hiding in the study would only confirm whatever assumptions family members were already making about my emotional fragility. I had survived worse challenges in corporate boardrooms, and I could certainly manage to maintain dignity in front of relatives who had known me since childhood. As we walked back toward the pool area, I could hear Uncle David's voice carrying across the patio, welcoming the new arrivals with his characteristic warmth and authority. The family members who had witnessed his speech about my failures were now watching him demonstrate the leadership qualities that had made him the family patriarch. But as we rounded the corner and the full scene came into view, I realized something was different about these particular arrivals. The voices greeting Uncle David carried a formality that distinguished them from typical family interactions, and I could see that he was using his most professional demeanor rather than the casual affection he displayed with relatives. What I saw when I looked at the new arrivals would change everything about this family gathering, and everything about how the Martinez family understood success, failure, and the complex relationship between the two. Standing beside Uncle David, shaking hands with him with the kind of careful respect reserved for important business relationships, was a man whose presence would transform this moment of personal humiliation into something else entirely. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most devastating moments create space for the most extraordinary revelations, and that the definition of failure depends entirely on who has the authority to make such judgments. The next few minutes would teach my family something about assumptions, about the danger of measuring success by familiar metrics, and about the possibility that the person they had dismissed as a cautionary tale might actually represent a kind of achievement they had never imagined possible. But I didn't know any of that as I walked back toward the gathering, still carrying the weight of Uncle David's public condemnation and the question of whether my life had indeed been a magnificent mistake disguised as professional success. The man extending his hand to Uncle David was impeccably dressed in a way that spoke of serious money and corporate power. His navy suit was clearly custom-tailored, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his presence commanded the kind of automatic respect that comes from occupying positions of genuine authority. I recognized him immediately, though seeing him here at my family's reunion felt surreal enough to make me question my own perception. William Thornton, CEO of Meridian Capital Group, stood in my uncle's driveway shaking hands with the man who had just publicly declared me a failure. Meridian was one of the largest private equity firms in Texas, with a portfolio spanning dozens of companies and assets worth billions of dollars. I had been following their activities for years, analyzing their acquisition strategies and studying their approach to portfolio management as part of my own professional development. "David Martinez," Uncle David was saying, his voice carrying the particular blend of confidence and deference he used when meeting important business contacts. "Thank you so much for coming out to our family gathering. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to meet you in person today." Thornton smiled with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing relationships that could prove professionally valuable. "I was in San Antonio for a board meeting that finished early, and when I heard about your family reunion, I thought it might be a good opportunity to discuss the proposal your company submitted for the West Side Development Project." My mind raced as I processed this information. Uncle David's construction company was apparently bidding on a project connected to Meridian Capital, which meant Thornton wasn't just a random business contact, but potentially a client whose decisions could significantly impact Martinez Construction's future. The timing of his arrival, So soon after Uncle David's speech about family values and business priorities carried an irony that would have been amusing if I weren't still reeling from being publicly humiliated. "Of course," Uncle David replied, gesturing toward the patio where the family gathering was still processing the aftermath of his earlier pronouncement. "Would you like to join us for a drink? We could discuss the details of your project away from the crowd." But Thornton's attention had shifted, his gaze scanning the assembled family members with the kind of systematic assessment that suggested he was looking for someone specific. When his eyes found me standing near the edge of the gathering, his entire demeanor changed, shifting from polite business interest to something approaching surprise and delight. "Elena Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio with unmistakable recognition. "I didn't expect to find you here. What a pleasant surprise." The sound of my name spoken with such familiar warmth by someone of Thornton's stature created a ripple of confusion through the family gathering. Relatives who had been carefully avoiding eye contact with me since Uncle David's speech were now staring with undisguised curiosity, trying to understand how I could possibly know someone who had clearly come to discuss business with their family, patriarch. Uncle David's expression reflected the same bewilderment I could see in the faces around me. His gaze moved between Thornton and me with the kind of rapid calculation that suggested he was trying to reconcile two pieces of information that didn't fit together in any logical framework he could construct. "You know my niece?" he asked, his tone carrying a note of uncertainty that I had rarely heard from him. Uncle David was accustomed to understanding all the variables in any situation, particularly those involving his family or his business. The discovery that I had some kind of connection to a potential client represented an unknown factor that clearly made him uncomfortable. Thornton's laugh was genuine and warm, the kind of response that suggested he found the question somehow amusing rather than simply surprising. "Know her? David, your niece is one of the most respected professionals in our industry. Elena and I have been working together for the past 2 years on some of Meridian's most significant acquisitions." The silence that followed this statement was profound enough to make the ambient sounds of the neighborhood seem unusually loud. I could hear a dog barking several houses away, the distant hum of air conditioning units struggling against the Texas heat, and the gentle splash of water as my youngest cousin continued playing in the pool, oblivious to the drama unfolding among the adults. "Working together?" Uncle David repeated, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality he used when trying to process information that challenged his fundamental assumptions. "In what capacity?" Thornton glanced at me with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that my family might not be fully aware of my professional activities. There was a moment of communication between us, a silent question about how much he should reveal, and what boundaries I preferred to maintain between my corporate life and my family relationships. I nodded slightly, giving him permission to share. Whatever information he felt was appropriate. After Uncle David's public assessment of my character and achievements, there seemed little point in maintaining the careful compartmentalization that had allowed my family to remain ignorant of the scope of my professional success. "Elena has been serving as the lead consultant on several of our portfolio restructuring projects," Thornton explained, his tone taking on the kind of professional respect he might use when describing a valued colleague to potential business partners. "Her analysis and strategic recommendations have been instrumental in turning around companies that were struggling when we acquired them." He paused, looking around at the assembled family members with growing awareness that he was sharing information they had never heard before. "Last year alone, her work helped us save over 3,000 jobs at companies that were facing bankruptcy when we bought them. She has a remarkable talent for identifying operational inefficiencies and developing solutions that improve both profitability and employee retention." The information landed like a series of small explosions across the gathering, each detail challenging assumptions that had shaped family conversations about my career for years. I watched my relatives' faces as they processed the revelation that my mysterious work in private equity involved saving jobs rather than eliminating them, that I was respected by industry leaders, rather than simply making money through financial manipulation. Uncle David's expression was particularly complex, cycling through confusion, surprise, and what might have been the beginning of recognition that his understanding of my professional life had been incomplete. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with his previous assumptions about my career. "Elena is remarkably modest about her achievements," Thornton continued, seeming to enjoy the opportunity to provide information that was clearly news to my family. "Most people in her position would make sure everyone knew about their successes, but she's always been more focused on the work itself than on getting credit for it." My cousin Sofia, who had been quietly observing this exchange from her position near the pool, spoke up with the kind of direct curiosity that had always characterized her approach to family dynamics. "Mr. Thornton, when you say Elena has been working with your company, what exactly does that mean? We're not really familiar with her work." Thornton's surprise at this admission was evident in his expression, though he was too polite to comment, directly on what must have seemed like an unusual lack of communication within our family. "Elena operates as an independent consultant, specializing in corporate restructuring and strategic planning. Companies hire her when they need someone, with the expertise to analyze complex financial situations and develop comprehensive solutions." He gestured toward me with the kind of professional respect that carried more weight than any personal endorsement could have provided. "She's what we call a turnaround specialist. When Meridian acquires a company that's struggling, Elena is often one of the first people we call to assess the situation and recommend strategies for improvement." My mother, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, asked the question that was probably occurring to everyone present. "How long has Elena been doing this kind of work?" "About 5 years at this level," Thornton replied. "But she's been building her reputation in the industry for nearly a decade. Her undergraduate work in economics and her graduate studies in finance gave her a strong foundation, but her real talent is for seeing patterns that others miss and developing creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems." Uncle David, who had been listening with increasing attention to this recitation of my professional credentials, finally found his voice again. "What kind of companies are we talking about? Manufacturing? Retail? What sectors?" "All kinds," Thornton said, warming to the subject with the enthusiasm of someone describing work he genuinely respected. "Last month, Elena completed a 6-month project with a regional grocery chain that was losing money, despite having good locations and strong community support. Her analysis identified supply chain inefficiencies that were eating into their profit margins, and her recommendations helped them reduce costs by 30% while actually improving service to their customers." He paused, glancing at me before continuing. "The chain employs about 1,500 people across 4 counties. Without Elena's intervention, they would probably have been forced to close half their locations and lay off most of their workforce. Instead, they're now profitable enough to be considering expansion." The details he was sharing painted a picture of my professional life that bore no resemblance to the vague, potentially questionable activities my family had imagined when I tried to explain private equity work. Instead of financial manipulation that served only wealthy investors, Thornton was describing targeted interventions that preserved jobs and strengthened companies that served their local communities. "Elena also worked on the acquisition of that manufacturing plant near Austin," Thornton continued, addressing Uncle David directly. "The one that makes specialized components for medical devices. When Meridian bought them, the company was 3 months away from bankruptcy, despite having contracts with major hospitals across the Southwest." Uncle David nodded with sudden recognition. "I read about that in the Business Journal. They ended up expanding their workforce and opening a second facility." "Elena's strategic plan," Thornton confirmed. "She identified operational improvements that allowed them to reduce production costs while maintaining quality standards. And she developed a marketing strategy that helped them secure additional contracts with hospital systems in other states." They went from near bankruptcy to becoming one of the most successful companies in Meridian's portfolio. As Thornton continued describing my professional achievements, I watched my family's perception of my career undergo a fundamental transformation. The mysterious, morally ambiguous work they had imagined was being replaced by specific examples of problem-solving that aligned closely with the Martinez family values of hard work, community service, and practical results. My Aunt Rosa, who had always seemed particularly skeptical of my career choices, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Thornton, you're describing Elena as someone who saves companies and protects jobs. Is that really what private equity consultants do?" Thornton's smile suggested he was familiar with the confusion that often surrounded his industry. The popular perception of private equity focuses on the failures and the companies that get broken up for parts. But successful firms like Meridian make money by improving companies, not destroying them. Elena represents the best of what our industry can accomplish when it's done ethically and strategically. He looked directly at Uncle David as he continued. "Your niece has probably saved more jobs in the past 3 years than most small business owners create in their entire careers. And she's done it by applying the same principles your grandfather used to build Martinez Construction: careful analysis, hard work, and a focus on sustainable improvement rather than quick profits." The comparison to my grandfather's business philosophy was not lost on anyone present. Roberto Martinez had built his construction empire through methodical planning, attention to detail, and a long-term perspective that prioritized sustainable growth over immediate gains. Hearing my work described in terms that connected it to his legacy created a bridge between my professional life and my family's understanding of meaningful achievement. Uncle David was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing information that required him to reconsider assumptions he had held for years. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a humility that I had rarely heard from him. "Elena, I had no idea your work involved this level of responsibility. When you tried to explain private equity, it sounded so abstract that I assumed it was just about financial transactions." "It's difficult to explain," I admitted, feeling more comfortable discussing my career now that Thornton had provided context that made sense to my family. "Most of the companies I work with are struggling when I first encounter them, so the details aren't usually things people want to hear about at family gatherings. It seemed easier to keep my professional life separate from family conversations." My cousin Miguel, who had been listening with the particular attention of someone who understood the challenges of running a business, asked a question that got to the heart of what made my work meaningful. "Elena, when you're helping these companies, are you thinking about the employees, or are you just focused on the financial returns?" It was a fair question, and one that highlighted the tension between profit motives and social responsibility that characterized much of the private equity industry. "Both," I said honestly. "The companies that hire me are usually in trouble because they're losing money, and if they can't become profitable, everyone loses their jobs anyway. My goal is to find solutions that serve both the financial needs of the investors and the employment needs of the workers." Thornton nodded approvingly at my response. "That's what makes Elena so effective. She understands that sustainable profitability and employee welfare aren't conflicting goals. Companies that treat their workers well and operate efficiently tend to be more successful in the long term than those that focus exclusively on short-term cost-cutting." As this conversation continued, I became aware that other family members were beginning to gather around us, drawn by the unusual nature of the discussion and the obvious respect that Thornton was showing for my professional abilities. Relatives, who had been maintaining careful distance since Uncle David's earlier speech, were now listening with obvious interest to this recitation of achievements they had never heard about. My cousin Sofia, who had always been protective of family relationships, addressed the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. "Mr. Thornton, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how exactly do you work with Elena? Is she an employee of your company, or is the relationship different than that?" Thornton's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that there were significant gaps in my family's knowledge about my professional status. He glanced at me again, seeking permission to share information that would probably surprise everyone present. Elena operates as an independent consultant, he explained carefully. Meridian retains her services for specific projects, but she also works with other firms and directly with companies that need her expertise. She's what we call a sector specialist, someone with the knowledge and reputation to command premium fees for her analysis and recommendations. Uncle David, who had been following this explanation with increasing attention, asked the question that was probably occurring to everyone present. What does that mean in practical terms? How does that kind of consulting relationship work? Thornton paused, clearly considering how much detail to share about business arrangements that were typically considered confidential. Without getting into specifics that might violate privacy agreements, I can tell you that Elena's consulting fees for a typical 6-month project are usually comparable to what a senior executive might earn in a full year at a major corporation. The information hit the gathering like a physical force, creating a moment of silence as family members processed the implications of what Thornton had just revealed. I had always been vague about my income when family conversations touched on financial matters, partly out of modesty, and partly because the numbers seemed so disconnected from their frame of reference that they would be meaningless. But hearing the information presented in terms they could understand, as a comparison to executive salaries at major corporations, provided context that made the scope of my professional success suddenly visible to people who had assumed my career was moderately successful at best. My mother's expression reflected a mixture of pride and bewilderment that I recognized from other moments when she had tried to reconcile her understanding of her daughter with evidence that challenged her assumptions. Elena never told us her work was so successful, she said quietly. Elena never told you a lot of things, apparently, Thornton replied with a warmth that suggested he was beginning to enjoy the opportunity to provide information that cast me in a more favorable light than my family had previously understood. Your daughter is remarkably accomplished, Mrs. Martinez. The respect she's earned in our industry is based on consistent results and ethical practices that many of her competitors can't match. Uncle David, who had been listening to this exchange with visible discomfort, finally addressed the obvious tension created by his earlier speech about my failures and misplaced priorities. Elena, I owe you an apology. When I spoke about your career earlier, I was operating from incomplete information. I had no idea the scope of what you've accomplished. His words carried genuine remorse, but they also reflected the particular discomfort of someone who prided himself on good judgment, discovering that he had fundamentally misjudged a situation. Uncle David's authority within the family was built, partly on his ability to assess people and circumstances accurately, and this revelation about my professional success represented a significant error in his analysis. I appreciate that, I said, though I wasn't sure an apology could entirely repair the damage done by his public condemnation. But I understand why you reached the conclusions you did. I haven't been very forthcoming about my work, and from the outside, my choices probably do look like misplaced priorities. Thornton, who had been observing this family dynamic with obvious interest, chose that moment to share information that would transform the conversation in ways none of us could have anticipated. Actually, David, there's something else you should know about Elena's work, he said, his tone taking on a more serious quality that suggested he was about to reveal something significant. Something that might be particularly relevant to your own business interests. Uncle David looked up with immediate attention, clearly recognizing the shift in Thornton's demeanor and the implication that whatever he was about to share had direct bearing on Martinez construction. Elena is the consultant I've asked to evaluate your company's proposal for the West Side Development Project, Thornton continued, his words creating a moment of profound silence as their implications became clear to everyone present. The proposal you submitted 3 weeks ago for the mixed-use development near the medical center is currently on Elena's desk. waiting for her analysis and recommendations. Her evaluation will determine whether Meridian moves forward with Martinez Construction as our primary contractor for the project. The revelation hit Uncle David with visible force, and I watched his expression cycle through surprise, confusion, and dawning understanding of the irony inherent in the situation. The man who had just publicly declared me a failure was learning that his company's largest potential contract depended on my professional assessment of their capabilities. "Elena is evaluating our proposal?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying to process information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the power dynamics at play. "She is," Thornton confirmed. "When I received your submission, Elena was the obvious choice to conduct the evaluation. Her expertise in construction industry analysis and her track record of identifying companies with the potential for successful long-term partnerships made her the natural person to assess whether Martinez Construction aligns with Meridian's standards for contractors." He paused, glancing around at the assembled family members who were watching this exchange with obvious fascination. "I have to admit, I'm surprised to discover that Elena never mentioned her family's construction business. That kind of conflict of interest is something she would normally disclose immediately." All eyes turned to me as I tried to find words to explain the complex dynamics that had led to this situation. The truth was that I had been aware of Martinez Construction's proposal for weeks, but I had assumed Uncle David would never want his family business evaluated by someone he considered a professional failure. "I saw the proposal when it arrived," I admitted, feeling the weight of everyone's attention as I tried to explain my reasoning. But given the family dynamics and Uncle David's feelings about my career, I assumed he would prefer to have the evaluation handled by someone else. I was planning to recuse myself from the project to avoid any appearance of bias. Thornton's expression suggested he was beginning to understand the family tensions that had led to this unusual situation. "Elena, you've never mentioned having family in the construction industry. Given your reputation for thorough disclosure of potential conflicts, I'm surprised this didn't come up earlier." "It's complicated," I said, aware that this explanation would require sharing information about family relationships that I had always kept separate from my professional life. My family has never been entirely supportive of my career choices, and discussing business with them has always been difficult. It seemed easier to keep those worlds separate. Uncle David, who had been listening to this exchange with visible discomfort, finally addressed the obvious question that was hanging in the air between us. "Elena, what did you think of our proposal? Professionally, I mean, setting aside family relationships." The question put me in an impossible position, requiring me to balance professional honesty with family diplomacy in front of both my client and my relatives. But Thornton's presence meant that any response would eventually become part of the official evaluation process, so evasion wasn't really an option. "The proposal is comprehensive and competitive," I said carefully, trying to find language that was both honest and diplomatic. "Martinez Construction has an impressive track record and clear capabilities for a project of this scope. There are some areas where the financial projections could be refined, and some operational details that might benefit from additional development, but overall, it's a strong submission." Thornton nodded with apparent satisfaction at my professional assessment. That aligns with my initial impression when I reviewed the proposal. "Elena, given the family connection that's now been revealed, how would you prefer to handle the evaluation process going forward?" Before I could respond, Uncle David spoke up with a decisiveness that reflected his characteristic approach to business challenges. "I think Elena should complete the evaluation exactly as she would for any other proposal. If Martinez Construction is going to work with Meridian Capital, it should be because we're the best choice for the project, not because of family relationships." His statement surprised me with its integrity, particularly given the potential financial implications of my assessment. The West Side Development Project represented the largest contract Martinez Construction had ever pursued, and Uncle David was essentially placing his company's future in the hands of the niece he had just publicly criticized for her life choices. "Are you sure about that?" I asked, wanting to be certain he understood the implications of his decision. "If I identify problems with the proposal that require significant revisions, it could delay your timeline or affect your competitiveness relative to other contractors." Uncle David's smile carried a self-deprecating quality that I had rarely seen from him. "Elena, based on what I've learned about your professional reputation in the past 20 minutes, I think Martinez Construction would be lucky to have your expertise applied to our proposal. If there are improvements to be made, I'd rather learn about them from someone who wants the company to succeed." Thornton looked pleased with this resolution to what could have been an awkward conflict of interest situation. "Excellent. Elena, please proceed with your evaluation as planned. I'll expect your report by the end of next week, and we can schedule a presentation for the following Monday if your analysis supports moving forward with Martinez Construction." As the immediate business discussion concluded, the broader implications of what had just occurred began to sink in for everyone present. In the space of 30 minutes, my professional status had been completely transformed in my family's understanding. From mysterious failure to respected consultant whose expertise would determine their family business's largest opportunity. But more than that, the entire framework that had shaped our family relationships had been fundamentally altered by the revelation that success could take forms that didn't fit traditional molds, and that the person they had dismissed as having lost her way might actually represent a kind of achievement they had never imagined possible. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the patio as relatives began to process what they had witnessed, and I realized that this family reunion would be remembered not for Uncle David's speech about traditional values, but for the moment when those assumptions were challenged by information that changed everything. What happened next would determine whether this revelation could become the foundation for more authentic family relationships, or whether the gap between different definitions of success would prove too wide to bridge even with greater understanding of what those differences actually meant. The silence that followed Thornton's departure stretched across the patio like a physical presence, broken only by the gentle splash of water as my youngest cousins continued their pool games, blissfully unaware that the adult world around them had just undergone a seismic shift. I could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes processing what they had witnessed, trying to reconcile the Elena they thought they knew with the professional powerhouse that Thornton had described with such obvious respect. Uncle David stood frozen near the barbecue pit, his confident patriarch demeanor replaced by something I had never seen from him before: genuine uncertainty about his own judgment. The man who had built his authority on decisive leadership and accurate assessment of people and situations was now facing the reality that he had fundamentally misunderstood his own niece for years. My cousin Sofia was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying the kind of careful curiosity that suggested she was trying to navigate uncharted family territory. "Elena, why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? About the companies you've saved, the jobs you've protected, the level of respect you've earned?" The question was fair, but answering it required explaining years of complicated family dynamics that had led me to compartmentalize my professional and personal lives so completely. "I tried to share some of it," I said, settling into one of the patio chairs as relatives began to gather around with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for major family announcements. But whenever I mentioned private equity or corporate restructuring, I could see eyes glazing over. It seemed easier to keep things general rather than deal with the confusion. My Aunt Rosa, who had always been one of the more skeptical family members regarding my career choices, shook her head with visible regret. "We thought you were being evasive because you were embarrassed about your work. Like maybe you were involved in something questionable that you didn't want to explain." The admission stung, even though I had suspected that some family members harbored doubts about the ethics of my profession. The popular perception of private equity as a predatory industry that destroyed companies for profit had clearly influenced their assumptions about my activities, despite my attempts to explain that the reality was more complex. "I can understand why you would think that," I said, trying to keep defensiveness out of my voice. "The industry has a reputation problem, and there are certainly firms that engage in practices I wouldn't be comfortable with. But there are also companies like Meridian that focus on sustainable improvement rather than quick profits." Uncle David, who had been listening with visible discomfort, finally found his voice again. "Elena, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation of why I reacted the way I did to your career choices." He moved closer, his expression reflecting the kind of serious consideration he usually reserved for important business decisions. "When you chose private equity over joining Martinez Construction, it felt like a rejection of everything our family had built," he continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "I saw it as choosing money over family, individual success over collective responsibility. I couldn't understand why someone with your intelligence and education would want to work with abstract financial instruments instead of building something tangible." The honesty in his confession surprised me, particularly coming from a man who rarely admitted uncertainty about his decisions or perspectives. "I never saw it as a rejection of the family," I replied. "I saw it as applying the same principles grandfather taught us about hard work and strategic thinking, just in a different context." My mother, who had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who had spent years trying to bridge these gaps, spoke up with characteristic insight. "David, I think part of the problem was that we couldn't see the connection between Elena's work and our family values because she was doing something none of us understood. It's hard to appreciate achievements when you can't visualize what they actually involve." She was right, and her observation highlighted one of the fundamental challenges of my relationship with the family. The Martinez success stories were all visible and concrete. Buildings that could be photographed, businesses that employed neighbors, achievements that could be explained in simple terms that anyone could understand. My work involved restructuring balance sheets and optimizing operational efficiency, concepts that didn't translate easily into dinner conversation. "Mr. Thornton mentioned that you saved 3,000 jobs last year," my cousin Miguel said, his tone reflecting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Can you tell us more about what that actually looked like? What kinds of companies were you working with?" The question gave me an opportunity to share details about my work that I had never felt comfortable discussing in family settings. One of the largest projects involved a chain of automotive parts stores that had been family-owned for 3 generations, I began, feeling more comfortable now that the context had been established by Thornton's earlier explanations. The owners were approaching retirement age, but their children weren't interested in taking over the business. They were planning to sell to a national chain that would have closed most of the local stores and consolidated operations in other states. That would have meant about 1,200 people losing their jobs in small towns where the parts stores were often one of the largest employers. I could see family members leaning in with interest as I described work that suddenly seemed relevant to their own understanding of business and community responsibility. Meridian acquired the chain instead, and my job was to figure out how to maintain the local stores while improving efficiency enough to compete with the national chains. "How do you do something like that?" Sofia asked, her teacher's instincts making her curious about the problem-solving process involved. "Mostly by identifying inefficiencies that the family owners had never noticed because they were too close to the daily operations," I explained. "Things like inventory management systems that were ordering too much of some products and not enough of others, supplier relationships that could be consolidated for better pricing, and marketing strategies that could help them compete more effectively with the big box stores." Uncle David was following this explanation with obvious interest, his business experience allowing him to understand the strategic challenges involved. "Were you able to keep all the stores open?" "Not all of them," I admitted. 3 locations were genuinely unviable because of changing demographics and competition, but we were able to consolidate those operations into nearby stores and offer positions to most of the displaced employees. Overall, we preserved about 90% of the jobs while making the remaining stores profitable enough to support wage increases for the workers who stayed. The details painted a picture of work that aligned closely with Martinez family values of community responsibility and practical problem-solving, even if the methods were different from what they were accustomed to. I could see understanding beginning to replace confusion in the faces around me. "That sounds like the kind of work grandfather would have respected," my Aunt Carmen observed, referring to my great-uncle's wife, who had always been one of the family's wisdom keepers. "He always said that business was about making things work better for everyone involved, not just the owners." Her comment touched something deep in my understanding of why my family's perception of my career had been so painful. Roberto Martinez had indeed built his construction empire on principles of mutual benefit, treating employees well because it made business sense, and contributing to community development because it created the kind of environment where businesses could thrive. I had been applying similar principles in different contexts, but the connection had never been visible to people who couldn't see past the unfamiliar mechanisms involved. "Elena," Uncle David said, his tone carrying a gravity that suggested he was about to address something important. "I need to ask you about the evaluation of our proposal for the West Side project. Given what's happened today, I want to make sure you're comfortable proceeding with that assessment." The question surprised me with its consideration for my feelings, particularly after the public humiliation of his earlier speech. "I'm comfortable with it professionally," I said carefully. "But I want to make sure you understand that I'll be evaluating Martinez Construction exactly as I would any other contractor. I can't let family relationships influence my professional judgment." "I wouldn't want you to," he replied firmly. "If we're going to work with Meridian Capital, it should be because we're the best choice for the project, not because we're family. What I want to know is whether you think we have a realistic chance of winning the contract." His directness surprised me, but it also created an opportunity for the kind of honest conversation about business that we had never been able to have before. "Based on my preliminary review, Martinez Construction is definitely competitive," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Your track record is strong, your pricing is reasonable, and your approach to project management aligns well with what Meridian typically looks for in contractors." Uncle David nodded with satisfaction, but I could see that he was waiting for more detailed feedback. "Are there areas where you think we could strengthen our position?" "A few," I admitted. "Your financial projections are conservative, which is good for risk management, but might make you seem less competitive compared to contractors who are willing to bid more aggressively. And your timeline estimates don't account for some of the regulatory challenges that are likely to arise with a project of this scope." As I spoke, I watched Uncle David's expression shift from defensive concern to genuine interest in the feedback I was providing. For the first time in our relationship, he was treating me as a professional colleague rather than a wayward family member who needed guidance about life priorities. "What would you recommend?" he asked, pulling out his phone as if preparing to take notes. "Revise your financial model to show more detailed cost analysis and include contingency planning for potential delays," I said, falling naturally into the consulting mode that had become second nature over years of client interactions. "And consider emphasizing your local knowledge and community connections as competitive advantages. Meridian values contractors who understand the regulatory environment and have established relationships with local officials." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as family members listened to me discuss construction industry dynamics, regulatory challenges, and strategic positioning with the kind of expertise that clearly impressed Uncle David. For the first time since I had chosen my career path, I was sharing my professional knowledge with family members who could appreciate both the complexity of the work and its practical applications. As the afternoon began to cool and relatives started preparing for the evening's activities, Uncle David approached me with an expression that combined humility with genuine respect. "Elena, I owe you an enormous apology for what I said earlier. Not just for being wrong about your professional accomplishments, but for questioning your character and your commitment to family values." His words carried the weight of genuine remorse, but I could also hear something else in his tone. Recognition that our relationship would need to be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than patriarchal authority. "I appreciate that," I said, accepting his extended hand. "But I also understand why you reached the conclusions you did. I haven't been very forthcoming about my work, and from the outside, my choices probably did look like misplaced priorities." "Maybe," he admitted. "But I should have asked more questions instead of making assumptions. And I definitely shouldn't have aired my concerns in front of the entire family like that." The acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected it would. Public humiliation required public acknowledgement, and Uncle David's willingness to admit his mistake in front of the same audience that had witnessed his criticism felt like genuine accountability rather than private damage control. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," he continued, his tone taking on the kind of serious quality that suggested a significant proposal was coming. "Something that might benefit both of us, if you're interested." I waited, curious about what he might have in mind. "I've been thinking about succession planning for Martinez Construction," he said, "about bringing the next generation into leadership positions and expanding our capabilities to handle larger, more complex projects. Your expertise in financial analysis and strategic planning could be invaluable to the company's growth." The offer was generous and thoughtful, representing exactly the kind of family integration that he had always wanted, but had never been able to achieve through pressure or guilt. "What kind of role are you thinking about?" "Chief Strategy Officer initially," he said. "Someone who could help us evaluate potential acquisitions, develop more sophisticated financial models, and identify opportunities for expansion that align with our core competencies. Eventually, there might be opportunities for broader operational responsibility as you learned more about the construction business." It was the same offer he had made the previous evening, but presented now with genuine respect for my professional abilities rather than as a rescue from a disappointing career. The difference in context made it feel like a completely different proposition. "That's a generous offer," I said, meaning it sincerely. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my consulting practice to join a single company, even a family business. The variety and challenge of working with different industries is part of what I love about what I do." Uncle David nodded with understanding rather than disappointment. "What if we approached it differently? What if Martinez Construction became one of your clients rather than your employer? We could retain your services on a consulting basis for specific projects, getting access to your expertise without requiring you to abandon your other professional relationships." The proposal intrigued me because it offered a way to contribute to the family business without sacrificing the independence and variety that made my current career fulfilling. "That could work," I said thoughtfully, "especially if Martinez Construction is planning to pursue larger projects that would benefit from the kind of strategic analysis I provide." "We are," he confirmed. "The West Side development is just the beginning. If we win that contract and execute it successfully, it could open doors to projects we've never been able to compete for before. Having a strategic consultant with your credentials could make the difference between steady growth and explosive expansion." As we discussed the possibilities, I realized that this conversation represented more than just a business opportunity. It was the beginning of a new relationship between Uncle David and me, one based on mutual respect and complementary capabilities rather than hierarchical expectations and disappointed hopes. The evening proceeded with a warmth and inclusion that I hadn't experienced at a Martinez family gathering in years. Relatives who had maintained polite distance since my career diverged from family expectations now approached me with genuine curiosity about my work and obvious pride in my achievements. The shift in perception was dramatic enough to feel almost surreal, but it was grounded in new understanding rather than temporary sentiment. As the reunion began winding down and family members prepared to return to their various homes and responsibilities, my mother pulled me aside for a private conversation that had been building all day. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of years of worry and hope. "Not just for your professional success, but for how you handled today. You could have been angry about David's speech. You could have used your position to embarrass him in front of his potential client, but instead you were gracious and professional." Her observation touched me deeply because it highlighted something I hadn't fully recognized about my own response to the day's events. Despite the pain of Uncle David's public criticism, I had instinctively chosen to respond with dignity rather than revenge, seeking understanding rather than vindication. "I love this family," I said, surprised by the emotion in my voice. "Even when we don't understand each other, even when the expectations and reality don't match up. Today showed me that there's room for different kinds of success within the Martinez legacy." As I drove back to my hotel that evening, I reflected on how dramatically the day had transformed my understanding of family, success, and the possibility of maintaining authentic connections across different life choices. The reunion that had begun with public humiliation had ended with professional respect and renewed family bonds. But more than that, it had demonstrated something important about the power of truth to transform relationships that seem irreconcilably damaged. Uncle David's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes, my family's openness to revising their assumptions about my career, and my own commitment to responding with grace rather than bitterness had created space for a new kind of family dynamic to emerge. 3 months later, I would complete my evaluation of Martinez Construction's proposal with a recommendation that Meridian move forward with the partnership. The West Side development would become the most successful project in the company's history, leading to additional opportunities that transformed Uncle David's regional construction business into a major player in Texas commercial development. But the professional success would prove less important than the personal transformation that began that afternoon at a family reunion when assumptions were challenged and relationships were rebuilt on foundations of truth and mutual respect. Sometimes the most devastating moments create space for the most extraordinary healing, and sometimes the courage to stand in your truth creates permission for everyone around you to become more authentic as well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.